Bellamar plantation sits like a silent colossus beneath a bruised twilight sky, its great white columns smudged with the dusk's choking haze. The evening air clings heavy with the humid weight of summer, the slow drone of cicadas weaving an unrelenting chorus through the tangle of live oaks and Spanish moss. In the kitchen, hearths glow dimly with lamp oil flames, casting trembling shadows on rough-hewn wood, where hands move methodically but without joy, setting the table for a dinner thick with more than food. Every footstep on the dirt paths is hushed, every glance flits like a nervous bird between the flickering lamplight and looming veranda. Behind weathered shutters, the servants prepare silently, the cloth dragged softly on rough boards, the sharp scent of hot iron from the cooking pots mingling with the faint bitterness of smoke and ash. Eliza stands apart, poised at the margin of this charged calm, her gaze tethered to the figure she cannot escape, the master. His frame is rigid, etched in sharp relief against the flickering lights. A man enmeshed in the heavy web of power and fear he has spun around himself and those he commands. The bracelets of callous flesh on her wrists tighten involuntarily, an echo of old iron chains, long burned away, but never forgotten. Her breath catches in the thick air, her senses sharpen as the murmured voices and the scrape of wooden chairs unfold into a delicate tension, a silence so loud it hums like the heat pressing in from every moss-draped branch. What truths will this evening spill into the darkness? What will linger unspoken beyond these walls, suffocated beneath the shroud of formalities and fear? The air vibrates with a quiet threat, the promises shackled tight beneath layers of silk and stained glass. The setting sun pulls long, twisting shadows across the veranda's polished floorboards. They stretch like grotesque fingers, reaching hungrily into the gathering night, harboring secrets as old as the soil itself. The plantation is a cathedral of oppression, where every creak of the window hinge, every whispered step across floored larders, threads tension through the air. In the half-light, the world shrinks to the acutely sensed, the rough texture of the table runner beneath Eliza's fingertips, the metallic taste lingering in her mouth, the faint rustle of a silken sleeve brushing against polished wood. Outside, the thick summer stillness hums with invisible watchers, the eyes of the enslaved, the ghosts of broken promises, the mute indictments of bruised earth. Would you dare to break the silence when the night itself seems ready to swallow the truth? A storm brews silently, more potent than thunder, more lasting than flame. Voices stir the dusk, low and careful, voices woven with fear and calculation. Accounts suggest whispered exchanges pass from hand to hand, forged in the crucible of shared plight. The named and unnamed plot, their fragile rebellion with careful precision. A rope, coiled and forgotten, hangs heavy with silent purpose. Beneath the veneer of rustling silk and polished silver sits a fractured world. Beneath smiles and formal nods, desperation thickens like thick oil in the bloodstream. Outside, the slaves move through the shadows like cautious specters, learning their steps, each footfall a prayer and a threat. The memory of whips and wounds lingers like a scent on the air, settling into every corner of the great house. Which path holds salvation, and which, death? The night folds over them, holding its breath, waiting for the first irrevocable cut. In these moments, Eliza's entire being trembles not with fear, but something colder, resolve. Her hands, hitherto still as the tomb, flex against the skin of her own wrists. Her gaze flickers to the master, whose face is unreadable in the flickering candlelight. The histories remain silent on her thoughts, yet her eyes betray a storm. Hunger for freedom, hatred laced with the quiet pain of endurance, and the simmering fuel of long-fostered rage. She is the calm eye of a hurricane in motion, wrapped in the heavy cloak of roles forced upon her, yet slowly unweaving from them, thread by thread. A single breath drawn deep, scented with smoke and sweat and iron, becomes more than a pause. It is an oath. Here, in the heat-slick stillness of Bellamar, a secret trembles on the edge of being, waiting for the hour to shatter it open and set a terrible tide loose. The night holds its silence, like a blade resting at its edge, and in that waiting, something vast and terrible begins to pull free from the shadows, stirring long-buried truths and whispers of rebellion, silent and terrible as a slow-burning fire beneath a fragile crust of ash. The wooden doors of Bellamar creaked open, a breath caught in the stagnant air, releasing a quiet tension that had coiled all day like smoke, refusing to rise. The lanterns flickered uncertainly along the veranda as servants, muscles taut beneath starched cotton, prepared the evening meal in movements too deliberate to be merely routine. The clink of silverware on ceramic cutlery echoed oddly in the humid silence, each metallic note a sharp fracture in the stillness. Eliza's eyes tracked the ritual unfurling before her, the meticulous setting of plates and the folding of linen napkins into shapes echoing false civility. Each gesture whispered a brittle promise of order, yet beneath every polished surface lurked the restless undercurrents of concealed dread and defiant hope. The master, seated upright and imposing, appeared carved from the very oak paneling, staunch, unyielding, but with shadows darkening his gaze that no candle could chase away. His command ruled through silence as much as speech, sending ripples of unease through the gathered souls. Eliza's hands, draped loosely in worn fabric, clenched and unclenched with minute friction against the coarse weave, betraying a tension her calm face denied. The air was scented with the faint musk of candlewicks burning low, mingled with the earthy tang of damp hearthstone and sweat. Outside the grand windows, the last rays of daylight bled the sky a bruised purple, elongating shadows across polished floors, shadows that seemed to pulse with the collective heartbeat of those poised on the edge of uncertainty. What weight bore down heavier here, anticipation or dread? The moment trembled still, pregnant with paths not yet chosen. Around the table, whispers of past injustices hung heavy like the heat trapped below window panes. Accounts suggest that Bellamar was a plantation crucible where the flame of rebellion smoldered beneath layers of fear and silence. The sharp clatter of a dropped fork was swallowed before it could echo, the hum of distant cicadas filling the spaces between held breaths. Servants and enslaved alike exchanged glances, their eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight and the flicker of unspoken plans. The air throbbed with a suppressed energy, as though the walls themselves strained to keep dark secrets from spilling into the night. The rope coiled silently in an attic corner was more than a tool of restraint. It was a symbol braided into the very fabric of their existence, binding, threatening, and yet perhaps holding a promise of release. Would you remain quiet under such a crushing yoke, or dare to fray its strands? Eliza's gaze, steady now, carved lines into the dimness between her and the man whose power demanded obedience. Her breath was steady but measured, each inhale a slow draw of tension and purpose. The rough texture of the tablecloth pressed beneath her fingertips, a tactile anchor in a room brimming with fraught expectation. Despite the veneer of poised hospitality, the atmosphere was taut, as if the very walls might crack and spill the truth, hiding in the shadows. The sound of a chair, scraping lightly against the worn floor, punctuated the silence, drawing all eyes momentarily to the master's silhouette, sharp with authority and marred by a sudden flicker of uncertainty. In this charged stillness, rebellion trembled on the lip of eruption, a silent promise waiting to be fulfilled. The night brimmed with whispers, the faintest hint of fire beneath ash. The dinner begins under a fragile veil of civility, as plates are quietly placed upon the worn oak table, their edges catching the feeble candlelight like fractured glass. The air inside the Bellamar dining room hangs heavy with a charged stillness, the scent of roasted game mingling with the lingering trace of sweat and damp cloth. Eliza sits poised, her hands resting lightly on the coarse linen, muscles taut beneath the surface, yet veiled in the calm of practiced restraint. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed steadily on the man at the head of the table, whose rigid posture fills the room with a suffocating authority. He moves with the slow certainty of a man who believes his dominion is absolute, but even his polished facade betrays a subtle tremor of unease, like the low, threatening hum of cicadas beyond the shutters. Around them, the dinner proceeds with the measured cadence of ritual, each morsel savored, every sip drawn with formal civility, masking the undercurrent of fear simmering beneath. The servants move with quiet efficiency, shadows flitting against the peeling wallpaper, as if the very walls themselves hold their breath. Outside, the night presses, dense and unyielding, the oppressive Louisiana humidity folded into every breath and whisper. The flickering candle flames cast long, wavering shadows that dance like specters against the walls, as if haunted by the memories of countless broken lives. The rope, hidden just out of sight, rests coiled beneath the floorboards, a mute witness to the oppressive discipline enforced here. Is it merely a tool of bondage, or does it hold the promise of something darker, something about to unravel? Eliza's fingers curl lazily around a silver knife, the cool metal pressing faintly into her skin, a subtle tightening of her jaw, a breath held almost imperceptibly. These are her quiet preparations. Accounts suggest she wears a mask of composure, yet beneath it simmers a fury tempered by years of silenced injustice. Her gaze, unwavering, scarcely blinks as it traces the curve of the master's throat, the space where power and vulnerability meet in fatal intimacy. The sound of a door gently creaking open somewhere deep within the house, the faint rustle of silk and cotton, act like tremors in the thickening air. The moment teeters on the edge of eruption, poised and fragile. Would you hold your hand steady, knowing the precipice you face? The night holds its breath, waiting for the irrevocable rupture that will rend Bellamar's fiery silence. The sudden uproar shattered the tension that had barely kept its fragile grip over Bellamar's dimly lit halls. Panic, sharp and quick as lightning, erupted like a storm breaking through a suffocating stillness. In the midst of the lavish dining room, guests and servants alike froze, their faces etched with disbelief, horror, and confusion. Claws of fear raked through the heavy air as the bloodied truth spilled across the polished wood like a defiant scream. The master's life rose and faltered in each trembling breath, a stark and harrowing mark on the night's fragile veneer. Around the room, the silent watchers, those who had waited in shadows, stirred, each understanding that this act was no mere murder, but a blazing spark that would ignite futures long bound by iron chains. The enslaved moved like ghosts through the sweltering darkness beyond the house, swift and silent as whispers of rebellion. Their escape was a litany of muted steps and hurried breaths, barely louder than the cicadas thrumming against the tangled undergrowth. Names fluttered among them like fragile wings, each whispered call stitching together a fragile tapestry of hope and survival. The rope, once a symbol of bondage, was severed, ashes of the past falling away as the night swallowed their footsteps. Trees closed around them like a protective shroud, leaves brushing against sweat-slicked skin, moss clinging damp against their calves. Shadows converged and fractured beneath a moon veiled by the thick gumbo fog, guiding uncertain feet toward freedom and away from the firestorm behind. Morning light revealed an eerie emptiness, as if the plantation itself had exhaled a long-held secret. Bellamar's vast rooms stood silent and vacant, save for the ghostly stains of blood and the faint scent of smoke that clung stubbornly to draped curtains and burnished floors. Survivor testimonies falter and fragment here. Some refuse to speak, others whisper in coded confessions locked in journals scrawled by trembling hands. The ledger of the plantation leaves gaping holes where stories should be, swallowed by silence or buried beneath layers of falsehood. The ashes of forgotten fires mingle with settling dust, marking where lives were lost and freedom won in a brutal calculus. What truth lingers in the ashes, untold, waiting beneath the stillness to be heard? The night's fury may have passed, but its scars etched deep remain unyielding. The morning after the dreadful night swallowed Bellamar's fiery silence, the plantation lay cloaked in an eerie stillness, an oppressive quiet that was heavier than the humid summer air. The great house, once alive with the clang of utensils and the murmur of hushed voices, now stood deserted, its vast rooms vacant except for the faint, stubborn stains of blood marking the floorboards. The heavy drapes hung untouched, bearing the faint scent of smoke and something metallic that lingered like a ghost's whisper. In the oppressive heat, flies circled aimlessly around abandoned plates, as if reluctant to disturb the relics of what had transpired. This was not just an empty house, but a vessel of broken stories, a place where echoes of violence and liberation hummed beneath the surface like a low undertow. Survivors of the night's upheaval were few and spoke in broken fragments or not at all. Their confessions scuttled like shadows on paper, secret journals, smuggled notes, careful whispers passed between trusted confidants. Accounts suggest a fracture between oral memory and the cold ledger of plantation records, gaps where names vanish, where the true extent of the revolt is swallowed by fear and erasure. The air held the weight of unspoken truths, the kind that burn in the chest but dissolve in daylight. Nearby plantations buzzed with nervous gossip, rumor sifting through the sugarcane fields like a restless wind. What was whispered in the shadows, and what would history dare to forget? The land itself seemed transformed, as if it bore the marks of that night deep in its soil. The oppressive summer heat hung thick, sun scorching the wilting cane stalks, and the damp, clay-rich earth clung to boots and bare feet alike. The slaves who escaped now scattered like wary birds, weaving through gum trees and moss, their footsteps muffled, but their spirits aflame. Yet Bellamar stood, silent and watchful, as a monument to both oppression and defiance. The rope, severed and discarded, became a symbol not of submission anymore, but of rupture, an indelible thread connecting past agony to fierce hope. Would the world remember what happened here, or would this silence deepen into oblivion? The story was far from over. The voice rising solemnly from the pulpit was thick with a tension that hung like a stone in the humid air of Bellamar's chapel. The preacher's words, a weaving of scripture and the raw realities of the plantation, pressed heavily on the congregation gathered before him, their eyes weighted with faith and fracture. His sermon breathed life into the paradox of divine justice and earthly terror, his voice a trembling candle flickering against the dark walls of doubt and hope. He spoke not only of salvation, but of the brutal contradictions clawing at his own conscience, torn between the sanction of bondage and the yearning for mercy. The scent of worn oak pews mixed with the faint musk of candle wax smoke, creating a tapestry of spiritual resolve and uneasy silence. His discourse traced the uneasy boundary between law and morality, justice and rebellion, weaving the coded fears of the masters with the clandestine prayers of the enslaved. The words hung, heavy as chains, echoing against the cold stone floor like a judge's gavel. Members of the congregation shifted uneasily, some nodding in fearful agreement, others with eyes cast downward as though caught in a web of unspeakable truths. The preacher's voice faltered briefly, weighed down by the burden of truths he dared only whisper, a testament to the fractured humanity mourning beneath the fragile veneer of order. Would divine providence bless a cause born in blood and defiance? The question hovered, unanswered, as if the very air choked back its reply. In the shadows of stained glass, flickering with candlelight, the preacher's sermon became a prism refracting the tangled moralities at the heart of Bellamar. His conflicted faith, grappling with the horrors born of human hands, was both a comfort and a crucible for those listening. The low murmur of prayers whispered silently through the stillness, mingling with the faint scent of incense and the rough grain of the wooden pulpit under trembling palms. This was no simple act of worship, but a reckoning of conscience, a fragile bridge between the brutality imposed and the hope that refused to die quietly. In that fragile space, the preacher's words became a mirror, fractured, haunting, and impossible to ignore. The plantation doctor's hands, steady yet burdened, grasped at wounds both physical and unseen. In the cramped, dimly lit infirmary, where the air was sharp with the bite of alcohol and medicinal herbs, his practiced fingers traced the ragged edges of freshly torn flesh. The linens held the scent of dampness, mingling with the faint musk of sweat and unwashed bodies. The doctor's gaze, clinical but laden with unspoken sorrow, counted the toll of bondage, bruises hidden beneath coarse fabric, cuts inflicted not just by tools, but by the relentless yoke of captivity. His role was paradoxical, healer to the broken, yet a cog in a machine that thrived on their suffering. The fine bone of a fractured arm, the slow pulse beneath the bruised skin, these told stories of escape attempts thwarted and punishments endured. The accounts suggest his ledger was heavy with contradictions, a tabulation of wounds meant to be tended yet allowed to fester. of life preserved only to endure anew next day. The doctor's hands, though skilled, could not mend the wounds etched deep into the spirit. In this cramped sanctuary from cruelty, the air often thickened with whispered fears and faint prayers, voices almost lost beneath the steady drip of sweat and the creaking of wood. Medicine was wrought from the natural world around, bitter roots, pungent poultices, crushed herbs, each remedy a fragile barrier against infection in the humid heat. Yet even the finest care was but a fragile veneer over a brutality that refused to yield, a reminder that liberation remained distant, hovering just beyond reach. Would you hold steady under such contradictions, healing within a system that inflicted harm? The doctor's conflicted role mirrored the fractured world outside, caught between duty and complicity, compassion and survival. Each healed wound was a testament both to resilience and to ongoing cruelty, a ledger of mercies granted and horror deferred. As the doctor's hands moved from patient to patient, tending to flesh riven by rope, blade, and fear, his presence was a quiet, bitter litany of bondage's enduring cost, a somber witness to the human toll hidden beneath Bellamar's imposing facade. The overseer's gaze swept the fields with a sharpness honed by years of commanding hours under the blazing sun and the ever-watchful eyes of distant masters. His role was both omnipresent and isolating, the unyielding sentinel charged with the daily enforcement of discipline and the relentless push for harvest quotas that sustained Bellamar's sprawling economy. The coarse fabric of his shirt clung to his back, soaked with the humidity that pressed like a living weight. His hands, calloused and steady, held the whip not only as a tool of punishment, but as an emblem of exacting order. He stood, a human bulwark, between the estate's owners and those they enslaved, tasked with weaving a brutal thread of control through the tangled lives under his charge. Beyond directing the rhythms of labor, from dawn's first light to the wearying dusk, the overseer dispensed rations of food, weathered clothing, and strict mandates, a harsh arbiter of survival within enslaved quarters. His presence was as much about surveillance as about management, shadowing fields where the suppressed murmurs of rebellion flickered like the heat shimmer above the cane. Among his duties lingered the grim task of punishment, meted out swiftly and often without mercy, ensuring that fear remained a constant companion to those who toiled for the plantation's gain. Yet records imply that even beneath this authority, there flickered undercurrents of fear and doubt. The overseer, too, was a man tethered to fragile power, ever wary of the fragile order he maintained. The overseer's gaze, cold but vigilant, hardened further as he paced the grand halls during the restless hours that followed Eliza's defiance. His eyes missed little. The hurried whispers, the furtive glances exchanged in shadowed corners, the coil of ropes hidden but not forgotten. Standing at the crossroads of violence and survival, his internal calculus was as precarious as the lives he oversaw. Would he seize the moment to crush insurrection with iron and fire, or would cracks in his resolve open pathways for rebellion beyond his control? The rope remained a silent witness in the night, its twisted fibers a dark metaphor for the delicate balance of domination and resistance that defined life at Bellamar. In the fields and behind the heavy shutters of Bellamar, resistance took many forms, some loud and combustible, others quiet and relentless. The enslaved fought their bondage not only with overt acts of rebellion, but through daily acts of defiance that chipped away at the rigid machinery of oppression. Accounts suggest that many slowed their labor deliberately, feigning sickness or exhaustion, dragging their hands through the sweat-soaked cane as if caught in the sticky fingers of fatigue. These acts of quiet sabotage were difficult to catch or prove, yet they exacted a subtle toll on the plantation's relentless demand for productivity. Each missed stroke or broken tool was a small rebellion, a whispered refusal to wholly yield. Beyond labor, stealthier forms of resistance thrived in the margins: stolen food, yams, salted pork, scraps that meant the difference between survival and surrender. Some wielded knowledge passed down in secret, ancient roots and bitter herbs that could poison without a trace, transforming the kitchen from sanctuary to silent weapon. Songs and stories became veiled codes, a living tapestry of history and hope threading through the warm night air that lantern light couldn't touch. Would the owners ever comprehend the vastness of this resistance woven beneath their gaze, or would it always slip through their fingers like smoke? The most dangerous act of resistance, flight, loomed like a constant threat to the plantation order. Some slipped away under cover of darkness, fighting through thorn and swamp, risking death or brutal retribution for a chance at freedom. Others practiced petit marronage, brief escapes into the thick woods to rest, regroup, and disrupt the pace of enforced labor. Each return was a calculated disruption, a defiant breath stolen back from captivity. Arson and sabotage, whispered in the margins of rumor, hazards feared and suppressed, but rarely documented with certainty. Resistance was not only an act of survival, but a fragile assertion of humanity, amid a world bent on erasure, a slow, relentless reclaiming of agency beneath Bellamar's relentless sun. Morning at the Bellamar estate revealed a landscape transformed, no longer just the site of harvests and masterly commands, but a space heavy with the weight of blood and shattered order. The once bustling house stood deserted, its polished floors streaked with stubborn traces of the night's upheaval. Faint wisps of smoke curled from abandoned hearths, and the scent of charred wood mingled with the lingering iron tang that clung to the air like a heavy fog. The sharp clatter of wind blowing through broken shutters added a hollow soundtrack to rooms emptied of their usual occupants. This was a place caught between worlds, between dominion and freedom, between silence and the clamorous aftermath of defiance. Outside, the sprawling fields bore the scars of flight and fury. Cane stalks, crushed and bent, whispered stories of frantic escape across their sweaty blades. The earth was churned uneven by hurried, desperate footsteps, bare and booted alike, marked in the moist soil as a map of resistance and hope. Survivors, scattered like the morning mist, remained veiled in cautious shadows. Their reflections flickered in the murky waters of forgotten swamps and hidden hollows nearby. Where once the rope had bound oppressed limbs, now cut lengths lay tangled in wild grass, symbolic threads untied in a desperate bid for liberty. The plantation ledger, deferential, where resistance thrived, offered only faint glimpses, gaps where fear, memory, and silence collided. The grand house, with its high ceilings and gilded mirrors, now echoed with absent voices and the faint pulse of unresolved reckoning. Although Eliza's name was whispered only in careful tones beyond the estate, her act of brutal defiance rippled wider than the walls could contain. Across the region, murmurs of revolt wove through the cane fields and river towns alike, carried by traders, preachers, and runaway slaves who transformed rumor into legend. Bellamar had been more than a place of suffering. It was the crucible from which a fierce blaze of rebellion leapt, a fiery silence broken, never to be restored. Would history remember this fracture as liberation or as loss? The estate's shadows hold their breath, waiting still for the answer. The weight of memory presses heavily on Bellamar's descendants, who wrestle with a tangled legacy where fact fractures beneath legend. The tale of Eliza's uprising has been folded into the whispered histories passed down on hushed plantation porches and in secret gatherings, a fragile thread of courage woven through the fabric of erased narratives. Fragmented archives leave gaps that oral histories seek to fill, spaces where the trembling truths of rebellion merge with the mythic, and where pain and pride entwine in equal measure. The past refuses to rest quietly, each telling a tentative defiance against the erasure wrought by power. Generations later, the contours of Eliza's story remain alive in memory's edge, a haunting silhouette sketched in shadow and firelight. Descendants speak of her not simply as a rebel, but as a complex figure within a world divided fiercely between law and rebellion, memory and silence. The plantation soil, thick with history, bears witness to the moral ambiguities that outlasted chains, the cost of freedom, the price of violence, and the resilience born in the crucible of survival. This narrative lingers as a spark, a cautious but unyielding flame against the dark ledger of erasure. Would you dare to remember what others seek to forget? Bellamar's story is never finished. It unfolds anew with each retelling, its silence as potent as its voice. The rope that once bound has transformed into a thread weaving between past and present, linking humans bound by history's ruthless chains, yet also by their shared hunger for justice. Here, in the interplay of myth and fact, suffering and hope, memory and loss, the story remains a challenge and a beacon. It is not a tale of simple heroes and villains, but a complex reckoning with the shadows cast by both. The aftermath of Eliza's rebellion at Bellamar did more than fracture an estate. It ruptured the very foundations of a plantation society built on ruthless control and silenced lives. Bellamar symbolized the fragile yet ferocious contradiction of an economy fueled by human bondage. It stood as a towering monument where wealth and violence were intertwined like the twisted ropes that bound enslaved bodies. The plantation's history is layered with the echo of footsteps, those of masters, overseers, and the enslaved, each imprint worn by struggle and resilience. Its significance lies not only in the grim ledger of profit and punishment, but in the stories of defiance that refuse to be erased, etched deep in the land and memory. Bellamar's prominence was tied to the vast networks of cotton and sugar that sustained Louisiana's economy, its fields a relentless pulse of labor under unforgiving heat. More than a mere plantation, it was a microcosm of the grave social and moral tensions that defined the antebellum South, a place where law, violence, and survival intersected in brutal clarity. The estate's story, especially Eliza's act of violence, challenged the vaunted order of the master class and struck at the hidden tremors of rebellion coursing beneath every field and hearth. It became a symbol, complex and conflicted, of a society teetering on the edge of collapse and inescapable change. Within the broader historical landscape, Bellamar exemplifies the critical moment when enslaved people's resistance coalesced into urgent action, a volatile nexus where suppressed rage erupted and forced a reckoning. Its legacy compels reflection on the moral ambiguities of power, the cost of freedom, and the persistent shadows left by centuries of bondage. As a site, real and symbolic, Bellamar invites us to confront the layered truths of history, not as neat narratives, but as ongoing dialogues between the silenced past and the voices striving to be heard. The plantation story remains a resonant call, echoing beyond its walls into the present struggle for justice and remembrance.